They thought they were chasing adventure. What they didn't know was that something ancient was watching them back. In the summer of 2009, three friends set out for a weekend escape in California's Redwood wilderness. They never returned. For 15 years, their families lived with no answers, until rangers stumbled upon something impossible: their forgotten campsite, untouched by time. How can life stand still in a place where everything grows? What warning signs did everyone ignore? Let me tell you about 5 hidden patterns that reveal what might have really happened in those woods. One of them so strange that even investigators refuse to include it in the official report. Ignore these signs, and you might miss the message nature has been trying to tell us all along. The first sign was the silence. Not the absence of sound, though that came later, but the unnatural stillness that settled over the trailhead parking lot where a blue Honda Civic sat abandoned. 3 days after Mark Marquez, Ethan Clark, and Noah Patel were supposed to return from their weekend camping trip, Park Ranger Tom Sutherland approached the vehicle, flashlight in hand despite the mid-morning sun. June 18, 2009, what should have been checkout day had become something else entirely. Vehicle still at Jedediah Smith Trailhead, Sutherland noted in his log. No contact in 72 hours. Keys visible inside console. It was that detail, the keys, that first made his stomach tighten. Nobody leaves their keys in plain sight while hiking, and nobody, especially not 3 experienced campers, leaves their phones locked together in the glove box. It was like they didn't want to be reached, Sutherland would later testify. Like they were deliberately disconnecting. But from what? The search began that afternoon. Helicopters scanning the massive redwood canopy. Dogs following scent trails that led 5 miles in and then vanished at a creek bed as if the men had simply stepped into the water and dissolved. Volunteers calling names that echoed back empty. Mark, Ethan, Noah. The forest absorbed their voices and returned nothing. By day 5, the search pattern had expanded to include off-trail areas. That's when they found the first real clue: a torn page from a topographical map pinned beneath a small pile of rocks. The coordinates scrawled in blue ink didn't match any marked trail. They pointed deeper into old-growth territory, into a section where the redwoods grew so densely that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. "Follow only if you're certain," was written beneath the numbers. Follow what? And who was supposed to be certain? 14 days into the search, Ranger Sutherland made another discovery that should have raised more alarms than it did at the time. The men's rental records showed they'd checked out a single 2-person tent, despite being a group of 3. More puzzling was what they'd purchased locally 2 days before departure: 200 feet of climbing rope, extra batteries, and a CB radio, none of which were on their original gear list. It was like they were preparing for something entirely different than what they told people, Sutherland explained. Something they hadn't planned for initially. The timeline had other irregularities. Their last known photograph, recovered from a water-resistant camera found near the creek, showed the 3 men smiling before a cluster of massive redwoods at sunset. The metadata placed them at coordinates miles away from where search teams were looking, miles away from any marked trail. In the background of that final photo, barely visible between 2 ancient trunks, a smudge of light that photo analysts later claimed was lens flare. But some who've studied the case insist it shows a 4th figure watching from the trees. This wasn't the first time people had vanished in America's wilderness. Between 1980 and 2020, over 1,600 people disappeared from national parks under circumstances that defied easy explanation. The cases followed similar patterns: experienced hikers, abandoned vehicles, search dogs, losing sense in impossible places. The redwood silence is not sudden, Ranger Maialu would explain during a 2010 press conference after the search was officially suspended. It begins in whispers, A misplaced item here, a delayed call there. You don't feel yourself vanish all at once. It happens while you're still moving. Liu's statement echoed what local tribes had been saying for centuries, that certain places in the forest demanded different rules of passage, that sometimes the very act of listening could be dangerous. The families refused to give up. Mark's younger sister, Lena Marquez, only 14 at the time, stood before news cameras clutching her brother's graduation photo. "He wouldn't just leave," she insisted, her voice cracking. "Something happened out there. Something nobody's telling us." She was right. There was something the official reports weren't sharing. 9 days into the search, a volunteer named Jack Lowell had used a personal drone to scan hard-to-reach ridges near the basin where the men's scent had vanished. The footage showed normal forest canopy until the drone passed over a small clearing. The feed distorted violently, sudden static, piercing audio feedback, then darkness. When technicians recovered the data, they found 11 seconds of corrupted video ending in a single still frame, a reflection in a pond showing 3 silhouettes standing perfectly still among trees. Forensic analysis confirmed the figures were human in build but found light refraction inconsistent with physical bodies. The audio contained a deep frequency hum, registering at 18 Hz, barely perceptible to human ears, but known to induce disorientation. Most disturbing was what happened when search teams tried to locate that clearing using the drone's coordinates. They couldn't find it. Not that day, not the following week, not in the months of searching that followed. The forest had swallowed whatever the drone had seen. By day 14, the official search was scaling down. Resources were limited. And with no bodies, no blood evidence, and no signs of foul play, the case was reclassified as a standard missing persons investigation. For the families, this was unacceptable. Theories proliferated online: kidnapping, voluntary disappearance, even supernatural explanations. Local forums shared stories about the Redwood Hush, a phenomenon where hikers reported all ambient sounds suddenly stopping, as if the forest itself held its breath. Amid this confusion, investigators noticed something that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The GPS coordinate logs submitted by multiple search teams contained recurring numerical anomalies. Several distances repeated exactly, 2.38 miles between certain markers, suggesting teams might have been walking in circles, despite moving in what they believed was a straight line. Retired Ranger Sutherland reported that compass bearings within certain zones all pointed toward magnetic north, even when physically turned away from it. Drones and tracking teams deployed after nightfall returned disoriented, their internal clocks off by hours. The scientific explanation was localized magnetic interference due to mineral content. But many rangers dismissed this theory, having worked the forest for decades without experiencing such effects. "There are places in the redwoods," Liu confided to a local reporter off the record, "where the rules bend, not break, bend. And if you're not paying attention to the warnings, you might bend with them." As weeks turned to months and months to years, the case of the 3 missing hikers faded from headlines. The families never stopped searching, never stopped asking questions, but the forest kept its secrets, until 15 years later when the drought came. June 14, 2024. California entered its 3rd consecutive year of severe drought. Waterways that had flowed continuously for centuries trickled to stagnant pools. Creek beds cracked open, revealing layers of sediment and forgotten debris from decades past. Ranger Elena Cortez was mapping drought impacts in the northern section of the reserve when she noticed a glint of something reflective beneath a layer of dried mud. Using a small trowel, she scraped away the caked soil to reveal the edge of a tarp. Not ancient, not degraded, but intact. "I found something odd near the West Fork," she radioed to headquarters. "Looks like a campsite, but it's strange." Strange didn't begin to describe what emerged as rangers carefully excavated the site. A perfectly preserved camp appeared, a green tent standing upright as if pitched that morning. A small cooking pot rested on a ring of stones, coffee grounds still visible inside. Two folding chairs faced the dead campfire. A paperback novel lay open, its pages unmarked by moisture or decay, despite having been partially buried for what carbon dating would later confirm was 15 years. It was the camp of the three missing hikers, and it looked like they had just stepped away for a moment. Everything was intact, Cortez reported. No animal disturbance, no insect activity, not even mold or fungal growth. It was perfectly preserved, like a museum exhibit. The most disturbing element was what scientists would call temporal inconsistency. Objects at the campsite showed no signs of the passage of time. The food in sealed containers remained unspoiled. The tent fabric hadn't degraded. Even the small digital clock on Noah Patel's backpack was still operational, the LCD display frozen at 11:42 p.m. "It's like time stopped in that one spot," said Dr. Samuel Wright, the forensic scientist called in to analyze the site. Everything outside the camp perimeter had aged normally. Fallen leaves had decomposed, surrounding vegetation had grown and died with the seasons. But within the clearing itself, time had simply refused to pass. The camp's discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community and reopened the investigation into the hikers' disappearance. Teams now had physical evidence to analyze, and what they found defied conventional explanation. Most telling was the journal found inside Mark Marquez's backpack. The first entries were ordinary, even mundane. Notes about trail conditions, observations of wildlife, inside jokes between friends. But on the third page, the handwriting began to change subtly. The words became more cramped, the sentences fragmented. By the final entry, dated June 14, 2009, the night they vanished, the writing barely resembled Mark's earlier script. The last entry read, "Something watching from trees, not animal. E thinks someone following since creek crossing. Keeps saying we shouldn't have come this way. Compass spinning. Same clearing twice now? N setting up emergency radio. Strange lights through fog. We are not supposed..." The sentence ended mid-thought, as if the writer had been interrupted. The pen mark trailed off the page in a sudden jerk. When forensic analysts examined the journal under ultraviolet light, they discovered pressure impressions on the blank page that followed. Words never written with ink, but pressed into the paper itself. "We are already remembered." Outside the journal's contents, the campsite held other anomalies. Soil samples taken from within the camp perimeter showed a near absence of microbial life, an impossibility in forest conditions. The ground itself seemed sterilized, while moss and fungus grew right up to an invisible boundary surrounding the tent, stopping in a perfect circle, as if respecting some unseen barrier. "The forest ends there," Ranger Cortez described it, "like it won't cross the line." Most unsettling was what happened when investigators reviewed their body camera footage from the initial discovery. In several frames where Ranger Cortez was reflected in the metallic cooking pot, her reflection didn't match her actions. It turned its head seconds later, lagging behind reality. In one frame, impossibly. The reflection showed three blurred figures standing behind her, figures not present at the scene. The footage was analyzed by 3 separate labs. None found evidence of digital manipulation. Whatever the cameras had captured was real, or at least as real as digital sensors could interpret it. For Lena Marquez, now 30 years old and working as a documentary filmmaker, the discovery of the campsite was the break she'd been waiting for since age 14. With official permission, she joined the investigation team as they continued processing the site. "I need to understand what happened to my brother," she told Ranger Sutherland, now head of the park's search and rescue division. "I need to see it for myself." Sutherland hesitated. "Lena, there's something not right about that place. The team that found it, they've been experiencing things since then. Disorientation, memory gaps. One ranger swears she keeps hearing whispers when she's alone. All the more reason I need to go, Lena insisted. Whatever it is, it took my brother. I deserve to face it. 2 days later, under controlled conditions with a medical team standing by, Lena entered the preserved campsite. The moment she stepped into the clearing, the ambient sound dropped away. Her microphone recorded complete silence, even as her heartbeat visibly raced on the biometric monitors. The air felt different inside the boundary, heavier, as if permanently exhaling. The light seemed to bend around objects rather than illuminate them directly. Most disturbingly, Lena reported a sensation of being watched by something behind every tree, something that remained just out of sight when she turned to look. As she examined the camp, Lena found her brother's camera bag tucked beneath his sleeping pad. Inside was a roll of developed photographs, images the initial search had never recovered. The pictures showed the progression of their hike, standard tourist shots of massive trees, selfies at scenic viewpoints, meals around the campfire, until the final 3 images. The first showed Noah staring upward, his expression a mixture of awe and fear, pointing at something in the canopy that the camera hadn't captured. The second showed Ethan standing at the edge of a clearing, his back to the camera, hands outstretched as if feeling something invisible. The third, the last photograph on the roll, showed nothing but darkness, except for what appeared to be a handprint pressed against the lens from the other side. What haunted Lena most was the marginal note Mark had written on the envelope containing these photos. They're not echoes, they're waiting. The scientific team assigned to the case struggled to explain the preservation phenomenon. Tests showed that within the campsite's perimeter, cellular decay occurred at less than 1,000th the normal rate. Organic matter, food, fabric, wood showed no signs of decomposition. Even the moisture level in the soil remained constant, despite the surrounding drought conditions. It's as if that specific location exists in a different temporal field, explained Dr. Amelia Chen, a quantum physicist brought in to consult. Time is passing, but at such a drastically reduced rate that it appears frozen to our perception. But even this extraordinary hypothesis couldn't account for the most disturbing aspects of the site, the way technology malfunctioned within its boundaries, the inexplicable reflections, the pressure writing in Mark's journal. Then came the audio analysis. Standard protocol required continuous audio recording during the investigation. When technicians processed these recordings, they discovered something buried beneath the apparent silence. Whispers, so faint that human ears couldn't detect them in real time, but clearly present in the spectral analysis. The whispers weren't random noise. They were words, fragments of conversations, some matching known recordings of Mark, Ethan, and Noah from their social media videos. Others belonged to voices no one recognized. Most chilling was what happened when investigators played these whispers through specialized equipment that could amplify and clarify them. 3 distinct phrases emerged repeatedly. We see you watching. Time remembers here. The trees know your face now. When these recordings became part of the official case file, local residents came forward with their own experiences. Many described a phenomenon they called the echoing name, a situation where shouting someone's name into certain valleys produced an echo that returned slightly delayed and subtly altered. You call out, and something calls back, explained Eleanor Whitefeather, an elder from the Yurok tribe, whose ancestral lands included parts of the Redwood Forest. But it's not your voice coming back to you. It's something using your voice to answer. Whitefeather shared that tribal knowledge had long warned against lingering in what they called the remembering places, locations where the ancient forest was said to preserve impressions of all who passed through it. Our people understood that the oldest trees don't just grow, she explained. They remember. Every face, every voice, every emotion becomes part of them. Some places in the forest hold those memories closer to the surface. Those are the places where people vanish, not because something takes them, but because they become part of what was already there. This traditional knowledge aligned with a disturbing discovery in the search records from 2009. One entry in a ranger's log, previously overlooked, noted, "We heard a woman's voice say it was cold, but all three who vanished were men." When investigators cross-referenced historical disappearances within the Redwood region, they found an unsettling pattern. Since 1925, 27 people had vanished without trace in areas where witnesses later reported temporal anomalies, watches stopping, electronics failing, compasses spinning. In 12 of these cases, search parties reported hearing voices that didn't belong to anyone present. 5 of the cases involved the discovery of perfectly preserved personal items months or years later, items showing no exposure to the elements despite being found in open clearings. The pattern suggested something systematic, not random accidents or criminal acts, but a consistent phenomenon tied to specific locations within the forest. As the investigation continued, those working closely with the preserved camp began experiencing unexplained effects. Several rangers reported recurring dreams of standing among redwoods, unable to move, while something circled them just out of sight. 2 researchers developed temporary prosopagnosia, inability to recognize familiar faces, after spending consecutive days at the site. Most concerning was what happened to the original discovery team. Of the 4 rangers who first excavated the campsite, 3 began experiencing episodes where they would find themselves walking toward the forest without conscious intention. One described it as being remembered by something that wants me to come back. For Lena Marquez, the effects manifested differently. Since visiting the site, she found herself experiencing what neurologists called temporal dysphoria, moments where her perception of time distorted dramatically. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, entire afternoons compressed into moments. Most disturbing were the brief blackouts, where she would suddenly wake to find herself staring at trees, camera raised as if photographing something she couldn't consciously see. During one such episode, reviewed later on her camera's memory card, her unconscious self had captured hundreds of images of seemingly empty forest. When analyzed with specialized software that detected subtle variations in light and shadow, each photo revealed the same thing: a standing figure partially obscured behind a tree, moving one step closer in each sequential image. The figure's proportions weren't quite human. "Whatever's happening," Lena told Ranger Sutherland after reviewing the images, "it's not just about my brother and his friends. It's about whatever found them. And I think it's still watching us." Sutherland, whose 30-year career had made him skeptical of supernatural explanations, was beginning to reassess his understanding of the forest he'd patrolled for decades. "I've always believed there's a rational explanation for everything," he said, "but rational doesn't always mean simple. Sometimes it means accepting that reality is more complex than we've been taught." What followed was a coordinated scientific effort to understand the preservation phenomenon. Researchers established a controlled perimeter around the campsite, deploying sensors to measure everything from background radiation to quantum field fluctuations. The data they collected painted a picture of a localized anomaly, unlike anything previously documented in natural settings. Within the campsite's boundaries, the electromagnetic field exhibited patterns typically only seen in laboratory conditions using specialized equipment, standing waves that neither dissipated nor propagated outward. Quantum measurements showed particle behavior consistent with what physicists called temporal isolation, a theoretical state where matter exists partially decoupled from the normal flow of time. "It's as if that clearing exists in a fold between moments," Dr. Chen explained, "not outside of time completely, but experiencing it at such a drastically different rate that interaction between our temporal frame and whatever exists there becomes complicated. This scientific framework helped explain some of the preservation effects, but failed to account for the more unsettling aspects: the whispers, the reflections that moved independently, the dreams experienced by those who visited the site. For those elements, the investigation turned to anthropological and indigenous knowledge. Elias Gray had spent 40 years studying forest folklore across North America. When the National Park Service consulted him about the Redwood anomaly, he arrived with a collection of similar accounts spanning centuries. "What we're seeing isn't new," Gray explained to the assembled team. "Indigenous stories describe places where the path walks in circles and the trees remember your face. Early European settlers documented locations they called witch woods, where compasses failed, and travelers reported meeting themselves coming the other way." Gray's research revealed that these accounts clustered around the oldest forests in North America. Not just the redwoods, but the ancient groves of the Pacific Northwest, the primeval forests of the Appalachians, and the old-growth regions of the northeastern woodlands. The common element isn't geographic, he noted, it's temporal. These phenomena occur exclusively in ecosystems that have remained undisturbed for thousands of years, places where the biological network has had time to develop in ways we're only beginning to understand. Recent scientific research had confirmed that forest ecosystems communicate through complex networks of fungal mycelium, creating what some researchers called wood-wide webs, where trees share resources, transmit information about threats, and even support weaker members of their community. Gray suggested that in the oldest forests, these networks might have evolved capabilities beyond our current understanding. We know trees record information in their rings: climate data, fire history, environmental changes. What if, in sufficiently ancient and complex systems, they record more? What if consciousness itself leaves impressions in these networks? This hypothesis gained unexpected support when soil samples from the campsite were analyzed for mycorrhizal fungi, the living threads that connect forest trees into communicative networks. The samples showed fungal structures unlike any previously documented, with unusual branching patterns that neurobiologists noted resembled certain neural networks in the human brain. More telling was what happened when researchers used specialized imaging to map the mycelium network around the preserved camp. The fungal connections formed a perfect circle surrounding the anomaly, with thousands of connections leading toward the center, but none crossing the boundary, as if the network had intentionally isolated that specific location. "It's quarantined," Dr. Chen observed. "The forest has walled it off." But from what? And why? The answer began to emerge when Ranger Sutherland discovered something the initial search had missed. Buried in the Forest Service archives were records of an unauthorized research project conducted in that exact location in 2007, 2 years before the hikers disappeared. Dr. Victor Reyes, a mycologist studying communication pathways in ancient forests, had established a temporary research station in what his notes called an unusually receptive clearing, where he claimed the mycelial network showed unprecedented response to stimuli. Reyes's project had been terminated after he began reporting anomalous temporal effects and non-standard sensory phenomena. His final report, filed 3 months before his funding was cut, contained observations that now seemed prophetic. The network appears to store and replay sensory information from any organism that enters the sample area. Initial tests show simple playback of recorded sounds, but advanced trials suggest more complex retention. Subject A reported hearing his own voice speaking words he had only thought, never vocalized. Subject C described seeing her own reflection in water before she approached the pond. Most concerning, all electronic equipment shows progressive temporal drift, with clocks losing synchronization after 24 hours of exposure. I believe we are witnessing a biological system capable of manipulating information across standard temporal boundaries. Reyes himself had vanished 6 months after his project ended. His vehicle was found at a trailhead 50 miles from the research site, with a journal entry suggesting he had returned to collect additional samples. Search teams never found him. When investigators located Reyes's original research samples, preserved in university storage, they made a chilling discovery. The fungal cultures had continued growing in patterns that replicated the exact arrangement of his research equipment. One culture had formed a structure unmistakably resembling a human hand pressed against glass. For Lena Marquez, these revelations provided the first real framework for understanding what might have happened to her brother and his friends. They hadn't just stumbled into danger, they had deliberately sought it out. Among Mark's personal effects recovered from the preserved camp was a thumb drive containing downloaded files, academic papers, news articles, and forum discussions about Reyes's research. Mark had been studying the mycologist's work for months before the camping trip. One document included the exact coordinates where Reyes had reported the strongest temporal effects. They went looking for it, Lena realized. They wanted to find what Reyes found. This explained the extra equipment they had purchased, the rope, the batteries, the CB radio. They weren't planning a simple camping trip. They were attempting to document something they believed existed in the forest. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when technicians managed to restore data from Noah Patel's damaged phone, recovered from the camp, but previously thought to be non-functional. The recovered text messages revealed a conversation between Noah and an anonymous contact who claimed to have worked with Reyes, unknown. The effect is strongest at night. Time slippage begins around hour 4 of exposure. Equipment fails progressively, oldest technology last. Noah, how do we know when it's happening? Unknown. You'll hear yourself, not echoes. Actual conversations you haven't had yet. Do not respond if you hear your name. Noah, what happens if we do? Unknown. Then you become part of what's already there. Remembered forever. Experiencing everything simultaneously. You think you're observing it, but it's observing you, learning you, becoming you. Noah, is that what happened to Reyes? Unknown. Reyes is still there, still talking, still being heard, just not in our now. The messages continued, detailing specific protocols for approaching the anomaly safely, maintaining physical contact with each other, using analog rather than digital equipment, limiting exposure to 4-hour intervals. The final message, sent the morning the 3 friends departed for their hike, contained a warning. Unknown. If anything unusual happens, anything at all, leave immediately. Do not attempt communication with whatever you perceive. It isn't communication as we understand it. It's assimilation. Based on the evidence from the preserved camp, it appeared the 3 friends had followed these protocols initially. They had set up their equipment methodically, using the rope to establish a physical perimeter, positioning analog recording devices at measured intervals. The journal entries described initial observations consistent with Reyes's reports, compass malfunctions, perception of sounds without visible sources, the sensation of being watched. But something had gone wrong on the 3rd night, the night the journal entry ended mid-sentence. With a clearer understanding of what the 3 friends had been investigating, the research team developed a more structured approach to studying the anomaly. Using Reyes's protocols as a foundation, they established a secure observation perimeter with carefully monitored rotation schedules to prevent extended exposure. Their findings confirmed many of the mycologist's original observations. Within the anomalous zone, time passed non-linearly. Mechanical clocks ran at different rates depending on their position relative to the center. Digital devices experienced more dramatic effects, with random data corruption and battery drainage occurring within minutes of exposure. Most significantly, the researchers documented what they termed temporal echoes. brief perceptions of events that hadn't yet occurred. Several observers reported hearing conversations between team members that took place hours later. Others described seeing colleagues in locations they wouldn't visit until subsequent shifts. It's as if time isn't flowing in one direction there, Dr. Chen explained. Past, present, and future events coexist, occasionally becoming perceptible across their boundaries. For those studying the phenomenon, the implications were both fascinating and disturbing. If the forest network was indeed storing and replaying information across temporal boundaries, then the three missing hikers might not be gone in the conventional sense. They could exist as information patterns within the network, Chen suggested. Their consciousness, their memories, their experiences, preserved and replayed like data in a biological storage system. This hypothesis gained support when audio recordings from the anomaly zone captured voice patterns matching Mark, Ethan, and Noah. Not just repeating words they had spoken before disappearing, but forming new sentences, responding to questions researchers asked aloud. In one particularly unsettling session, a researcher asked, "What happened the night you disappeared?" The response, extracted from background noise and enhanced through audio processing, was chilling. "We heard ourselves calling for help. We followed our own voices deeper. The trees showed us where to go. Not gone. Still here. Still walking. The forest remembers for us now." For Lena Marquez, these communications provided both comfort and horror. The possibility that her brother still existed in some form, but might be experiencing a consciousness untethered from normal time, potentially aware of his situation for what would subjectively feel like eternity. The research took an unexpected turn when Dr. Chen proposed a radical experiment. If the anomaly was indeed storing and processing information across temporal boundaries, then perhaps it could be communicated with intentionally, not just through passive recording of ambient sounds, but through deliberate questions directed at specific entities within the network, using specialized equipment designed to detect and amplify the subtle electromagnetic fields associated with the mycelial network. Chen's team developed what they called a biological interface, a system that could potentially translate human thought patterns into signals recognizable to the forest network. The first test subject was Ranger Sutherland, whose decades of experience in the Redwoods had given him what he described as an intuitive understanding of the forest's patterns. Connected to the interface equipment, Sutherland focused his thoughts on a single question: what happened to Mark, Ethan, and Noah? The response came not through audio or visual means, but as a direct impression in Sutherland's mind, a series of sensory experiences so vivid that he later struggled to translate them into words. "I was them," he reported afterward, visibly shaken. "All three simultaneously. I felt what they felt that night." They were setting up equipment when they heard voices calling their names, their own voices but from different directions in the forest. Noah wanted to leave immediately. Mark insisted on investigating. Ethan was already responding, already walking toward one of the voices. Sutherland described how the three friends had become separated, each following what they perceived as calls for help from the others. As they moved deeper into the anomaly zone, their perception of time began to fragment. Minutes stretched into hours. The forest around them shifted subtly, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks repeating in impossible patterns. They kept finding themselves back at the camp, Sutherland continued, but each time, something was different. Equipment moved, notes changed, clothing they didn't remember removing folded neatly inside the tent. It was as if multiple versions of themselves were occupying the same space, overlapping, but never quite connecting. The final moment came when all three simultaneously returned to the camp from different directions, each believing they had been searching for hours, only to find the others appearing at exactly the same instant. "They saw themselves," Sutherland whispered. "Not just each other, actual duplicates of themselves standing on the other side of the clearing. And when they called out, their duplicates called back with the exact same words at the exact same time. The boundary between observer and observed collapsed completely. What happened next defied simple explanation, but Sutherland described it as a dissolution of individual identity into the larger network. The three friends had not died in any conventional sense, but their consciousness had been absorbed into the forest's information system, their memories, personalities, and awareness continuing to exist as patterns within the ancient network. They're still experiencing, Sutherland concluded, still aware, but not as separate entities anymore. They've become part of something much older and more complex than human consciousness was designed to comprehend. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond the fate of three missing hikers. If ancient forest networks could indeed store human consciousness, preserving it across normal temporal boundaries, then the distinction between living organisms and their environment blurred in profound ways. For the scientific community, the discovery represented a paradigm shift in understanding consciousness itself. For the families of the missing, it offered an explanation that was simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. But for those continuing to study the anomaly, it raised urgent questions about safety and containment. If human consciousness could be absorbed into the forest network, what prevented this phenomenon from spreading? What determined who was taken and who was merely affected? And most critically, was the absorption deliberate and intentional action by the network, or simply the natural consequence of humans encountering a system operating on principles they weren't equipped to comprehend? With the basic mechanism of the disappearance now understood, researchers turned their attention to the broader patterns surrounding such incidents. If similar phenomena existed in other ancient forests, there should be warning signs, identifiable precursors that might help prevent future disappearances. The investigation expanded to include historical records from national parks across North America, focusing on cases where hikers had vanished under similar mysterious circumstances. Through this comparative analysis, 5 distinct patterns emerged, warning signs that had preceded nearly every documented case of anomalous disappearance in old-growth forests. The first and most consistent was what researchers termed the vanishing signal, the progressive failure of electronic equipment in specific forest locations. In nearly every case, victims had reported unusual technology malfunctions in the days or hours before vanishing. Phones losing service despite being in coverage areas, cameras capturing corrupted images, GPS devices showing impossible coordinates or routing users in circles. Technology always fails first, Ranger Lou explained during a briefing with park staff. That's nature's opening move. It's not just equipment failing, it's a boundary forming between different information processing systems. In the case of Mark, Ethan, and Noah, this warning had been clearly present. Their final phone communication showed increasingly corrupted text messages. Their camera contained glitched images where certain elements, particularly faces and figures, appeared blurred or duplicated. Most telling was Noah's last message to his sister. "Phone acting weird. GPS keeps showing us in the wrong place. Same coordinates, but different terrain each time." The second pattern, the repeating path, involved spatial disorientation that defied normal navigational errors. Victims frequently reported walking in what they believed was a straight line, only to arrive back at their starting point. Some described landscapes that seemed to reconfigure themselves when not directly observed, landmarks appearing in impossible locations, trails that led to different destinations than expected. Mark's journal contained multiple references to this phenomenon. "Third time we've seen the lightning-struck tree today. He swears we've been walking away from it for hours. Same tree, same broken branches, same moss pattern. How?" The third pattern, now termed the altered voice, involved subtle changes in written or spoken communication. In cases where victims left notes or recordings, linguistic analysis often showed progressive shifts in syntax, word choice, and even handwriting, changes too significant to be attributed to stress or fatigue alone. The journal recovered from the preserved campsite demonstrated this pattern clearly. Mark's writing had transformed over just 3 days, not just becoming more erratic, but incorporating phrases and sentence structures entirely uncharacteristic of his normal communication style. The final entries contained terms and references he had never used before, as if another voice was gradually merging with his own. The fourth pattern, the preserved space, was rarer but particularly significant. In several historical cases, searchers had discovered locations where environmental decay seemed suspended. Small areas where fallen leaves remained fresh for months, where snow didn't melt despite warming temperatures, where insects and scavengers appeared to avoid certain perimeters without obvious reason. These preserved spaces aren't just physical anomalies, Dr. Chen explained. They're boundaries between different temporal frames, places where the normal flow of entropy is altered. Finding such a space isn't just strange, it's a warning that you're standing at the edge of something that processes reality differently than we do. The final and most unsettling pattern, the echoing name, involved auditory phenomena, where victims reported hearing their names called from the forest, often in their own voices or the voices of companions, even when those individuals were demonstrably elsewhere. In folklore across cultures, following such voices invariably led to misfortune or disappearance. Noah's recovered text messages referenced this specifically. Keep hearing someone calling us from different directions. Sounds exactly like Mark's voice, but M is right next to me. Happened 3 times now. When these 5 patterns were correlated across historical cases, they formed a consistent progression, a sequence of warnings that, if recognized, might allow people to retreat before reaching the point of no return. What we're seeing isn't supernatural in the traditional sense, Dr. Chen told the assembled research team. It's a natural phenomenon we haven't had the framework to understand. The forest network processes information differently than our brains do. When human consciousness interfaces with it too directly, without proper preparation or protection, integration occurs, not because the forest is malevolent, but because that's how it responds to new information patterns. This understanding led to the development of specific protocols for forest rangers and search teams. Areas where multiple warning signs appeared were designated as high-risk zones, requiring specialized training and equipment. Hikers reporting technology failures or orientation problems were immediately escorted from those areas, regardless of their desire to continue. For Lena Marquez, the identification of these patterns provided both validation and a framework for processing her grief. The brother she had lost wasn't the victim of an accident or a crime, but of an encounter with something beyond human comprehension, something that, in its own way, had preserved him, even as it transformed him into something she could no longer reach. "He's not gone," she told Ranger Sutherland as they stood at the perimeter of the preserved campsite. "He's just experiencing existence in a way we can't fully understand. And maybe that's not entirely a tragedy." But the most profound insight came from Eleanor Whitefeather, whose ancestral knowledge had predicted much of what science was only now confirming. "Your people think of consciousness as something that exists only inside your bodies," she explained. "Our people have always understood that awareness exists throughout the living world, in different forms, at different scales, processing reality in different ways. What you call disappearing into the forest, we might call remembering who we really are. Patterns of information temporarily organized into individual forms, but always part of the larger living system." This perspective offered a new framework for understanding not just the fate of the 3 hikers, but humanity's relationship with ancient ecosystems. The boundaries between observer and environment, between individual and collective consciousness, were more permeable than modern science had previously acknowledged. For those continuing to study the Redwood anomaly, the focus shifted from rescue to communication, developing safer interfaces between human cognition and the forest network, seeking to establish dialogue without risking absorption. The preserved campsite, now surrounded by sophisticated monitoring equipment and protective barriers, remained a testament to the moment when three curious explorers stepped beyond the threshold of normal human experience. Their fate, preserved consciousness within an ancient information system, represented not an ending, but a transformation into a state of existence humanity was only beginning to comprehend. 15 years after the disappearance of Mark Marquez, Ethan Clark, and Noah Patel, their story has fundamentally changed how we understand our relationship with the world's oldest forests. Their experience, preserved in journals, recovered data, and the extraordinary time capsule of their campsite, has become both warning and invitation. Warning to approach ancient ecosystems with appropriate reverence and caution. Invitation to reconsider our place in the living networks that surround us. The Redwood Anomaly Study Project, established in 2024, now monitors similar phenomena in old-growth forests worldwide. Using specialized equipment developed from Dr. Chen's research, teams can detect early signs of temporal distortion and information boundary formation. Hikers entering national parks receive education about the 5 warning signs, with clear instructions to retreat and report if they encounter any unusual patterns. For most visitors, these ancient forests remain places of beauty and wonder, their anomalous properties dormant or expressing only in subtle ways that pose no danger to casual observers. The risk of consciousness integration appears linked to prolonged exposure and deliberate engagement, conditions that ordinary hikers rarely experience. But for researchers continuing to study these phenomena, each discovery opens new questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If awareness can exist within biological networks spanning thousands of acres and living for thousands of years, what does this suggest about the potential forms intelligence might take? If information, including the patterns we call human personalities, can be preserved and processed by such networks, what does this imply about the boundaries of life and death? For Lena Marquez, these questions have become her life's work. Now leading a specialized research team, she has developed methodologies for limited communication with the forest network, techniques that allow information exchange without risking integration. Through these interfaces, researchers have confirmed that the consciousness patterns of the 3 hikers continue to exist within the network. More profoundly, they appear to be experiencing a form of awareness that transcends normal temporal limitations. Perceiving past, present, and future simultaneously, their individual identities both preserved and transformed within the larger system. They aren't trapped, Lena explained in her landmark paper on forest consciousness. They're expanded. The terror we associate with their disappearance reflects our limited understanding, not their actual experience. They've become part of something that processes reality in ways our isolated consciousness can barely comprehend. This perspective has provided comfort to the families of the missing, even as it challenges fundamental human assumptions about individuality and continuity. The 3 young men who entered the forest that summer day haven't been lost. They've been remembered in the most literal sense, their patterns preserved within a system that forgets nothing it encounters. For those who study the Redwood anomaly, the most profound insight may be that what happened to Mark, Ethan, and Noah isn't new. Indigenous knowledge from cultures worldwide suggests similar phenomena have occurred throughout human history. consciousness transfer between individual and ecological systems, preserved in myth as transformation into trees, merging with rivers, or being claimed by mountains. What distinguishes modern encounters is not the phenomenon itself, but our framework for understanding it. Where previous generations interpreted such events through spiritual or mythological lenses, contemporary science now offers models based on information theory, quantum consciousness, and biological network processing. Yet despite this evolving understanding, the fundamental experience remains beyond full human comprehension, a transformation that can be approached intellectually, but never completely grasped from outside. The forest doesn't take people, Eleanor Whitefeather observed at the conclusion of the official investigation. It remembers them. And in being fully remembered by something so ancient and vast, they become part of its remembering. For those who visit the Redwoods today, the story of the 3 missing hikers serves as both caution and invitation, a reminder that the oldest living systems on our planet process reality in ways we are only beginning to understand. The warning signs remain the same. When technology fails without reason, when paths repeat despite clear navigation, when voices call from impossible directions, when decay stops in clear boundaries, when echoes return changed, pay attention. The forest is speaking, and sometimes what it says is turn back. For those who choose to listen, who approach these ancient ecosystems with appropriate reverence and awareness, the Redwoods offer a glimpse of consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual human experience, a reminder that we exist not as isolated observers of the natural world, but as participants in living networks that span scales of time and space, far beyond our ordinary perception. 15 years after 3 friends vanished into the forest, their campsite remains, preserved not just by anomalous temporal effects, but by the careful stewardship of those who study it. A reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but experienced with appropriate respect for their complexity. The Redwoods have been alive for thousands of years. They've seen us come and go, and in their patient, silent way, they remember us all, whether we notice or not. Sometimes the forest doesn't hide its secrets, it waits. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in nature? Something that made you question what's real? Share your story in the comments below. If this story shook you, subscribe for more real-world mysteries, hidden warnings, and the truth behind the unexplained.